Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be here today to share with you some of the insights that I've gathered along my journey as a marketer, working at 3 or 4 startup companies and now at a very, very large enterprise. A lot of the ideas that I'm going to share with you today come out of not only my experience working as a marketer, but all the interviews that I conducted that went into the writing of my book, The Agile Marketer, and that have come out of the many conversations that I've had with really, really smart marketers on the Marketing Agility podcast, which I co-host. Marketers at small companies, at big companies, working in a B2B context and a B2C context. And so I'm really excited to share some of these insights with you today. I will mention that I know that there are a lot of folks in the audience today whose purview is broader than just the marketing context. So the focus of my book is about how marketing is changing, but I'll pay special attention today to point to the broader implications for the business of what is changing in the marketer's world. So with that, let's just jump right in. Marketers are working in just an incredibly exciting time today. I'd say that we're really working in what I would describe as a new era of marketing, an era in which we can look across the entire customer lifecycle like never before, where we can measure and understand the journey like never before. It's also a time when our customers are more vocal than ever before, largely because of social media. They can express themselves at every stage of the journey. And we're at a time where there is this promise of marketing technology which is coming to market, incredible new marketing technologies which promise to let us to listen and react in a personalized way at scale across the journey. When you put these things together, marketers are really positioned today to step up to being the steward of customer experience, not just the steward of the brand. In fact, if you survey marketers, and the big analyst firms have done this repeatedly, they will tell you that their businesses, their companies are going to be competing primarily on the basis of customer experience. In many cases, when they were surveyed in the past, they said that we would be competing on this basis by 2016. Now it's 2017 now, and I don't really think that we are truly competing on the basis of customer experience yet, but I think it does really speak to where marketers think the business is headed. So the reality is that while it's an exceptionally exciting time for marketing, it also may be the most challenging time to be a marketer. And I want to focus on 3 buckets of challenges that marketers face. I want to drill into them a little bit and use that as a backdrop for our conversation today. So the first one has to do with technology. Marketing is really, our tradition is based in psychology, not in technology, right? But we find ourselves in an environment in which software is truly eating the world, and the marketing stack along with it, right? MarTech is proliferating at a greater rate than we're seeing consolidation taking place. So if you look at the graph here, I'm just showing the number of new entrants, new companies, compared to the amount of acquisition and mergers and consolidation that's taking place, right? If you think about the maturation of the marketplace or the ecosystem, there's a period of expansion. It's like a diamond. And then you cross an inflection point and you start consolidating and stabilizing the structure of the market. We haven't really turned that corner yet. What that means is, we see new companies coming to market. There's a lot of venture investment that believes that there are needs that are still unmet in the marketing technology stack. So overall, that says that the ecosystem of marketing technology is not mature yet. It means that there are still gaps that exist. It means that there's probably a lot of overlap between solutions in the marketplace, and that marketers face a lot of integration challenges as we try and do our work. We try to build that stack that's going to help us deliver on that promise of delivering personalized communications at scale. So the next challenge has to do with collaboration. Here, I want to talk about the fact that our peers in product management have gone through an absolute revolution when it comes to the way that they approach their work. That revolution was kicked off over 15 years ago when some very, very smart software developers wrote something called the Agile Manifesto. It turns out that that document, that manifesto, really revolutionized the way that product management works, and it's led to the empowerment of product management, right? If we think about the most innovative and exciting companies in innovation centers around the world, these are most oftentimes, product-driven companies. In the graph here, I'm showing a proxy for what the adoption curve looks like. I'm showing Google Trends research about relative search volume for the term Agile software development. And you can see that there's been linear adoption over a fairly long period of time. Now, it is the dominant approach. It is the best practice when it comes to software development and more generally, product management. The challenge that marketers face here is that while our peers in product management have gone through a revolution in the way that they do their work, marketing has not gone through a complementary revolution or modernization of the way that we work. And so where our product management peers have stepped up to being the stewards of innovation and taken on incredible leadership roles, marketers are still focused on establishing credibility with the business and figuring out how they can build this platform that's going to help them deliver on the promises that I mentioned a moment ago. So the last challenge that I want to talk about has to do with the amazing amount of disruption that we're facing in our businesses, just the overall rate of change increasing. So in the diagram here, I'm showing a look at turnover in the Fortune 500 dating back to many years into the 60s. And what you can see, of course, is that the rate of change is increasing over time. Now, there's a lot that goes into that number and into that graph, but at a macro level, this correlates really well with what I'm hearing from all the marketers that I interviewed for my book and that we bring on the Marketing Agility podcast. They are experiencing more change in the marketplaces in which they're engaging in than ever before. Smaller companies are disrupting established companies more than ever before. Just the amount of market factors that they are trying to grasp, measure, and understand is becoming greater than they can really wrap their arms around. So I want to tell you about a new approach to marketing that will help you build stronger and more resilient marketing platforms that are going to help you deliver on that promise of personalized engagement at scale. It will help you improve the way that you engage with your product management peers and the rest of the company for that matter. And it will help the marketers in your organizations truly step up into the role of being the steward of customer experience, not just the steward of the brand, where they can have more credibility and start making meaningful contributions across CX that are going to help your companies be more competitive. So it's a new approach to marketing, but it's not a new approach. Fundamentally, it is the same approach that revolutionized the product management function. It's called Agile. And when I talk about Agile, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about little a Agile, which is a vague term that we often use to describe just being able to move more quickly or be more responsive. I'm talking about big A Agile. Big A Agile is an approach or philosophy that is designed for contexts where there's a lot of disruption and a lot of change, where it's very difficult to predict the future. And it deals with that by making small investments, incremental investments that are testing the marketplace, validating direction, validated learning, and then repeating the process over and over again to help you zero in on product market fit. Now, this approach or philosophy is made actionable by very well-defined methods. So you may have heard of some of these. The two most popular are called Scrum and Kanban. These are well-documented methods that teams can be certified in. And these methods are really composed of a large number of underlying practices, which really get bundled up into a method, right? So I'm talking about something that's pretty binary in the sense that you can look at a team and say, is this team practicing Agile or not? Okay? So I'm talking about something that's pretty rigorous here. Now, I want to go back to the beginning of the adoption of Agile in the context of the software development world or the product management world. Back over 15 years ago, when those initial software developers wrote up something called the Agile Manifesto. Why did they do that? And to get at that and to explain that a little bit, I want to share with you something called the Cynefin framework. And I think it's useful for us to look at it because the Cynefin framework happened to have been authored at exactly the same time that the Agile Manifesto was written. And when we understand the framework and when we walk through it, I think it'll help us understand why there was so much adoption and so much interest in Agile at the time. Now, the Cynefin framework was created by a guy named David Snowden and a woman named Cynthia Kurtz while they were at IBM. It's considered to be what they call a decision-making framework. And if you're wondering why I'm pronouncing it Cynefin with the spelling on the slide here, it's because Cynefin is a Welsh word. It means habitat or ecosystem. And they chose that word because they wanted to connect it to this idea, or connect the framework to this idea that in an ecosystem or a habitat, there are things that are happening where you can very clearly see the relationship between cause and effect. But there are other levels within an ecosystem where there are things that are happening where it's very hard to understand what is driving the interaction between elements in an ecosystem. And they chose that metaphor because the Cynefin framework is about looking into a system or looking into a problem space and trying to understand what is the best approach to the particular problem that you are facing. So let me just start walking you through the framework, and I think this will make a little more sense. So in the first quadrant we're going to talk about is the simple quadrant. This is the space where there's a very clear relationship between cause and effect, where you can sense what's happening, you can categorize what's happening against a known set of patterns, and then you can respond. So this is an area where I like to say there are known knowns. You know what the overall problem space is, you know what the things in the problem space are, and you can match them against known patterns. Now the space directly above, the complicated space, there's also a relationship between cause and effect, but it's not immediately apparent what that relationship is. So you sense, but then you need to do some analysis to understand what's happening, and then you can respond. So this is a zone in which instead of having best practices like we do in the simple domain, we have, there can be multiple good practices that coexist. This is the area of known unknowns, meaning that we know what the overall problem space is. There are things within that problem space that we may not know or understand well, but with analysis we can understand them sufficiently well that we can respond appropriately. To the left of that quadrant is the complex domain. And the complex domain is different in that you really cannot understand the relationship between cause and effect in advance or with analysis. Here, in order to understand or determine the relationship between cause and effect, you need to probe or run tests that produce results which you can sense, and then you can respond. So this is the domain of unknown unknowns. You don't know what the whole problem space is. You don't know what the things within that space are. We figure out what's in that space, and we figure out what the overall space starts to look like by running tests in the space. When we run a test that's successful, we amplify it. When we run a test that's not successful, we dampen it. Okay, so this is a space where the solutions are really emerge out of the testing that we do. The last space that I want to talk about is the chaotic space. The chaotic space is one that we often enter for innovation, but it's also a space that we can fall into when we try and apply the rules of one domain to a problem that doesn't belong in that domain. So for example, when we try and apply the rules of the simple domain to a problem that doesn't belong in the simple domain. And that squiggly line between the simple and chaotic domain represents that that boundary is different than the others, in that it's more like a cliff that we can fall off of if we continue to apply the rules of the simple domain to problems that aren't in that domain. Or said another way, if we become complacent when it comes to applying a problem-solving method to problems that don't belong there. So the chaotic space is one in which we need to act quickly, sense, and respond. We don't have time often for going through the probe, sense, respond process. This is a situation that big companies find themselves in when they have been disrupted because they didn't see something coming or they weren't thinking about new problems and new opportunities in the right way. It's very difficult to recover when you fall into this space. Finally, there's the center of the diagram, which is labeled disorder. This is just the space that we occupy when we're trying to determine which problem space we should apply to a problem. Overall, the quadrants on the left are ones in which, it's very difficult to predict the future. The quadrants on the right are ones where things are more predictable and where our traditional methods like waterfall are adapted well. Where Agile is most effective is in that complex domain and to some degree the chaotic one. So the reason that the software developers wrote the Agile Manifesto and why it became quite popular is that more and more of their business or their work was moving from that complicated domain into the complex domain, right? That's what was really driving change in the software development world. And now it's really affected the rest of the business because, as I said before, software is taking over everything that we are doing as businesses. It's certainly taking over the marketing world as marketers manage more software than ever before. So to make this a little bit more tangible, I want to share a story with you about two companies that were founded to create a solution that would meet the exact same market need. So imagine company W that uses the waterfall approach and company A that uses the agile approach. Company W gets started on their project with a planner who is going to put on the complicated domain hat and do an analysis of the problem space and come up with a solution and a set of requirements they'll hand off to a designer who will ultimately hand a design off to a developer, then a tester, and 6 months later, they'll launch their product to serve the market need. Now, company A has a planner, a designer, a developer, and a tester, but instead of working in series, they're working in parallel together, and after 1 month, they launch a mini version of that product. But next month, they do it again, and again, and again, as they advance towards a more and more fully featured product over time. Now, if we look at this from a different perspective, company W spends 2 months and they've just finished their planning and they're handing off to design. In the meantime, company A has launched one version of their product and then a second iteration of that product when a bunch of their users tell them that the thing that they're building actually doesn't meet the market need that they thought they were meeting, and shares some information about how they can course correct to get to a product that actually meets product market fit. So this company is able to pivot slightly and head towards that new destination. But company W won't get that feedback from users until 4 months later. Now, certainly that company could have shared prototypes and things with their users along, design mock-ups and specifications along the way, but it's just not the same as giving users an actual product to interact with. And so by the time they get to the 6-month destination, they are going to have to rip out some of what they've built or pivot very, very hard to get to product market fit, right? Company A is basically taking the hypotenuse of this triangle and the shortest path to product market fit. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that waterfall is not a very effective approach to work. Waterfall can be fantastically effective and highly efficient if you happen to know exactly where you are going. But the problem is, again, much of the work that we are doing is such that where we think product market fit is, the assumptions that we've made about that, our predictions about the future, they are wrong. And things are changing very, very quickly in the markets that we're working. So that's why product management teams adopted Agile. So what does this all have to do with marketing? Well, let's look at a third company where the marketing organization is still using the traditional waterfall approach, but where the product management function has embraced Agile. It should be pretty clear why this won't work, right? The marketing team is working on their 6-month plan and heading in that sort of waterfall trajectory, trying to build that straight and efficient path. But the product team is pivoting month by month and zeroing in on product market fit. Very quickly, they're going to be out of sync with each other. And this is why the most innovative companies are adopting Agile, not just for product management, but also in the marketing function, so that they can share process, stay aligned, and collaborate more effectively together. When they're doing this well, it's possible to bake marketing right into the product. And I'll just say personally, this has been some of the most interesting and exciting work that I've ever done, and some of the most effective work that I've ever done, where the boundary between product and marketing gets really, really blurred. Like, just think about all the social applications that we engage with, where as we engage with the product, we are also promoting the product, right? That's just a simple example of applications that really blur this boundary. So this is a really, really exciting space, and we'll talk more about this later. But I don't want to overlook or miss having the opportunity to mention that marketers are managing more software than ever before. And at this point, Agile is the dominant best practice for managing software. So for that reason alone, marketing organizations need to look really, really hard at investing in getting up and running with Agile and adopting these practices. But for the purpose of this conversation, I want to get back to collaboration, because collaboration is really, really critical when it comes to getting to a place where we can truly compete on the basis of customer experience, which is kind of the aspirational role that marketers have an opportunity to step up to. Now, I subscribe to Peter Drucker's view that he wrote almost 30 years ago, just incredibly prescient comments about the fact that, in his view, marketing and innovation were going to be the two primary drivers of the business. Now, when he talked about innovation, he was really talking about product management, the steward of innovation. And from his perspective, for companies to really be competitive, these two leaders had to work really in lockstep together. They had to be completely aligned. So when we go back to thinking about that the overall customer experience and that infinity loop that I showed at the beginning, and we think about what's involved in making sure that the experiences all along that journey are consistent and positive and aligned, right? In many cases, marketers are in absolutely the best position to measure and understand the overall customer lifecycle, but marketers oftentimes find themselves in a situation where they just don't have purview over the experiences at many of those touch points, right? Certainly, our product management peers care a lot about customer experience within the context of the product, because that is their particular area of focus. But the reality is, a lot of the experience, most of the experience, happens outside of the product. And so for us to be able to have influence over all those different touch points, for marketers to really make a difference and step up to delivering value as the steward of customer experience, they need to collaborate really effectively with the folks who can impact the experience across all of those different touch points. That's why collaboration is really so important. So I want to return to the Cynefin framework for one moment and just talk about why this agile transformation can be so challenging for businesses, well, for marketers, but actually for the entire business, and particularly for the most established businesses or the most established enterprises. The reason has to do, and I want to return to the comment that I made about the chaotic domain here, because the reason that it is so challenging is that most established businesses have become established by getting really good at repeating and optimizing a path to value. They've found something that works, and they've gotten really good at repeating that thing and scaling that thing. And right underneath that, that's not companies, it's actually just human beings. The psychology that, of human beings is such that when we get a reward, we start carving a pathway towards that reward, right? We build these incredibly significant neural pathways that help us get to rewards. But what we don't think about as individuals or as we build the culture within our companies is that as we build those pathways as individuals and build business practice around them and then build a culture around them, and we make those pathways deeper and more efficient, we also make it really hard to get out of those pathways. And so what happens is that those pathways are sort of the simple domain. Those pathways represent a space in which we understand well the connection between cause and effect. The problem is we start facing challenges in our business that don't fit well into that domain. But because we're so fixed in that domain, we become complacent about applying the rules of the simple domain to problems that really don't belong in that domain, right? And so we get into this position where we try and make problems in the outside world conform to the domain that we're most comfortable in, rather than looking at a problem in the marketplace and changing the way that we approach that problem based on the problem itself. And that complacence can lead big enterprises to get disrupted. And that's when they fall off that cliff into the chaotic domain. And that can be very, very hard to recover from. So this is part of the reason why it's really important, especially for large enterprises, that they embrace Agile so that they can build up this competency to be able to handle problems that are in the complex domain, because that is where more and more of the business challenges that we face are going to land. The good news is that there is a really strong ecosystem developing around adopting Agile practices or around Agile transformation. There are at the top end, the biggest consulting companies out there, the McKinseys and the Bains, are developing Agile practices to help drive Agile from the top down into companies. They've, not only are they building teams, but they're starting to do research and they're starting to publish that research. From the bottom up, there are organizations that will come into your company and they will train the teams that are kind of in the trenches and middle management on how to adopt Agile. So I'm talking about companies that can, for example, certify teams, train and certify teams on some of the methods that I mentioned earlier, Scrum or Kanban. More of these companies are coming to market, and the ones that exist are getting bigger. There's also a lot of tooling in the marketplace that's coming to market to help marketers who want to embrace Agile. So I'm talking about tools like Asana and Trello and LeanKit and Jira. There are so many of these companies coming to market. It is in and of itself a true validation that marketers, there's just an incredible need on the business side for support as we make this Agile transformation. Of course, there's conferences and more tracks at conferences, and then there's books coming to market, including mine, which I hope you'll pick up and read. Here I'm just showing, again, some Google Trends research about relative search volume associated with the term Agile Marketing. You can see a similar pattern to what we saw earlier with Agile software development. The key thing to know here is that we are this is still very, very early days. This ecosystem is really nascent. And if you were to compare the search volume to a term like content marketing, you would see that it's quite dwarfed today. But I think we're at the beginning of what I hope will prove to be a significant uptick in adoption. So I want to transition to talk a little bit about what can you do as a leader, as an executive at your enterprise, to help facilitate this agile transformation. And I'm going to share some anecdotal evidence that comes out of mostly the conversations that I have on the Marketing Agility podcast with marketers who are working at large enterprises. So the most common case that we see is that there are entrepreneurial marketers within these companies who have seen the value of Agile, either from another workplace or just they've worked with product management, or they have a background in IT and they've come into the marketing world. And they're adopting Agile, and in some cases they're trying to pilot it and convert others in the marketing function. This is a case where we don't see much success when it comes to driving overall transformation at the company. Most often what we see here is that these marketers are very successful using it within their function or their group, but when they leave the company, that group falls back on the traditional practices that they're surrounded by effectively. At the other end of the spectrum, we see a very small number of companies where there is a leader who is bought in to Agile and Agile transformation, and it might engage with one of those consulting firms like the Bains or the McKinneys to drive it down into the company. And here we actually see pretty good success because those individuals can invest in the training and the resourcing necessary to make that transformation happen. But the absolute best scenario that we see, which is only about 15% of cases, are ones where you have an executive who gets it and who's bought in, and you also have those middle managers who are using it in their teams, and there's this meet in the middle situation. And there we see the absolute best success. Now, if you were to look at small companies, which is not the focus of our conversation today, you'd see these numbers would be much better. Smaller companies have an easier time with Agile adoption. So as an executive, as a leader, what can you do to really help facilitate this change? Some of the most important things you can do have to do with a mindset change. So I want to talk about 3 examples or share 3 stories that speak to the mindset change that executives have to embrace in order to help facilitate Agile transformation at their companies. In the first example, I want to go back to the story that I told you about 2 companies. Remember that the Agile team put something out into the marketplace in their second iteration that really wasn't meeting product market fit, and that their customers provided them feedback that they weren't happy with. Now, most executives are not comfortable with the idea of putting something into the marketplace that is inconsistent with the brand. Now, I think that this kind of represents a misunderstanding of the relationship between a company and their customers, the community. Because, first off, a brand isn't what we say it is. A brand is what our customers say it is. And it turns out that customers are not disturbed by or upset by companies that put things out into the market where they are testing, or that things that may be imperfect. What really upsets customers is when companies make the same mistake repeatedly. But in this story, I shared an example where a company put something out there, they took feedback from customers, and they changed course. When that happens, the customers actually feel like they are helping facilitate the development of this better product. And in that sense, they take some ownership in that process and the product and in your brand along the way. They are helping you get to product market fit. And they will become a platform for amplifying awareness of your product, and they will become advocates for your product if you can demonstrate that you can listen and return value. So this experience of putting something that may not be perfect into the market can actually be a mechanism to strengthen the affinity that a consumer has with your brand. So Another way of looking at this is saying that failure is actually a requirement in this new world. When you're operating in the complex domain, failure is a requirement of getting to success. Now, the Agile approach is an iterative one that breaks things down into the smallest possible components that can be released. So the failures that you're going to have are going to be small, but you're going to have many, many more failures than you have successes. So executives need to get their mind around that and create a culture in which failure is accepted. Making the same mistake twice is not accepted. So the second story that I want to share has to do with a solution to a traffic problem. And the first one that I want to speak about is the traffic light. This is an example of a top-down solution, right? We look at historical data associated with traffic moving through an intersection. We analyze that data and we define a solution or a program that's going to control those lights, right? It's a centralized decision. It's highly predictable. You know exactly what the throughput of that intersection is going to be. Now let's compare that to a roundabout. A roundabout is kind of the reverse of that in the sense that it's not looking at historical data. It's looking at real-time data on the ground in that intersection. It's a distributed decision-making process because the folks who are making the decisions are in the cars entering and exiting that roundabout. And it turns out that this approach is more efficient. The throughput of a roundabout is greater than that of a stoplight. And in addition to that, it's a much more flexible solution in the sense that it can handle unanticipated traffic flows much more effectively than the stoplight can. Now, the key thing to understand here, though, is that it requires that we're comfortable empowering the folks in the cars as they're entering and exiting the roundabout. It is a mindset change in the sense that it requires that we put a lot more trust in those folks who are really closest to the data and closest to the experience on the ground. It's also important to acknowledge that this is harder for the people who are on the ground. We're asking them to do much more work. It's not as passive as the experience of engaging with a stoplight, but the benefits are worth it because the throughput is better. So the mindset change here is really one that requires that executives get comfortable with sort of flipping the command and control structure, the traditional command and control structure where it used to be that 60% of the direction of the strategy was coming from the top down and maybe 40% was coming from the bottom up. In this model, 60% of the innovation strategy and insights are going to come from the bottom up. And less of the strategic direction is going to come from the top down. So that's a pretty significant mindset change for most leaders today. So the last story that I want to tell you about has to do, or is in the domain of investment and financial management, financial control. And I would put this story in the context maybe of the relationship between the CMO and the CFO. So on the left, I'm showing a chart here of the traditional budgeting process that a CMO and CFO might go through at the beginning of a year. I'm showing two budgets. One is about twice as large as the other. And if you look at the spending pattern of the budget, you can see that they're quite similar. Now, this is the annual budgeting process, right? So at the beginning of the year, you're effectively giving a bag of money to the person managing that budget, right? Now, at the beginning of the year, they've just built this plan. They know exactly what's in front of them, and they're going to spend a bunch of money. As they get into Q2 and Q3, they're still going to continue spending and investing in their programs, but they're going to be a little more conservative because they may want to save some powder so that they can be opportunistic about something that happens towards the end of the year. And as they approach the end of the year, they start spending more aggressively. Why is that? Well, when you give somebody a bag of money, you're setting a top to their budget in that most managers know that there's going to be significant consequences associated with spending more money that they've been allocated. But they also know that you've set a bottom in the sense that if they don't spend it all, the likelihood of them getting it next year is decreased. And so at the end of the year, they start spending on things that they haven't researched as deeply. They start making more discretionary spending that don't necessarily return the greatest ROI, right? They may have some money in their budget that they could spend on something discretionary, while another team it has an incredible opportunity that they just don't have the money to invest in. Now compare that to the iterative budgeting process, a more agile process, where the CFO and the CMO operate much more like a bank, right? They meet with the folks managing spend on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis. Those folks are coming to the bank, so to speak, with fresh data about opportunities that they have in front of them right now, right? This is a lot more like that roundabout model, where we're empowering these teams to build database business cases with fresh data that we can analyze in real time and direct money to where it's going to get the best ROI for us, right? So this is a much more transparent, honest way of managing budget that really helps drive the greatest ROI for our investments. So I want to close with a couple final statements about Agile. I want to make sure that I don't leave you with the impression that Agile is a holistic operating system for the marketing function or for the rest of the business. When we reflect back on the Cynefin framework, Agile is really optimized for the complex domain. Now, that happens to be where we're spending more of our time, but traditional practices like waterfall are still optimized, and in many cases the best practices, on the right quadrants of the Cynefin framework. And so they need to be integrated together. The sea change, though, that's happening here is that because we're spending more time in the complex domain than we are in the other domains, we need to swap out waterfall with Agile when it comes to the platform on which we're building our company culture, right? I talked about the way that Agile approaches collaboration differently, the way that it prevents complacence, the way that it empowers teams. There's also other benefits when it comes to employee satisfaction and productivity that we didn't have a chance to talk about today. But adopting Agile as this cultural platform sets us up for a world in which we're no longer, it's becoming harder and harder to compete on the basis of features or products, right? It's easier and easier to replicate features and products. What's harder to replicate is customer experience. And customer experience requires that you can effectively operate in that complex domain. And so the culture that you build is going to increasingly become your sustainable competitive advantage because it's going to help you compete on the basis of customer experience. Now, I think marketers have a really fascinating role to play because marketers are the first business unit that's really adopting Agile in a meaningful way, and we're serving as a gateway that's bringing this approach and philosophy into the rest of the business. As we do that, it gives us an opportunity to establish more credibility with the rest of the business. It gives us more ability to impact the customer experience and step up to that role of serving as a steward of customer experience, not just the brand. Peter Drucker really said it best when he said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." This is the thing that is going to really help our companies be more competitive. And I think it's really exciting that marketers have a critical role to play in this journey. So thank you so much for your time today. I've appreciated sharing some of these ideas with you. Hopefully I've inspired you to think a little bit more about how you can implement Agile in the context of your business. And if you're interested, I hope you'll pick up my book and dig deeper. Thanks so much for your time.